So we're going to get started. So what we've done so far, this is our 5th class session. What we've done in the previous 4 sessions is we began with an understanding of wholeness. And what we decided to use was this idea of I and thou relationships, which means that we're authentic in how we approach other people, and we are attentive for their own authentic self. And then what we did is we looked at the impediments to changing ourselves to make ourselves able and available for those kinds of authentic relationships. The impediments that come from outside of us. They're not internal. They're not something about ourselves. They're about the systems, the groups of relationships that we live in. Because what sociologists and psychologists have found is that while you might think that everybody wants you to change for the better, actually oftentimes other people don't, which is perhaps a bit odd. But all that it means is people are often self-centered, and it's somehow to their interest if you stay the way you are and not change, even if it's for the better. So we used Harriet Lerner and we used Marshall Rosenberg to look at ways that that if you want to change, how you can start moving through those relationships and those groups in ways that allow you to change despite resistance. Then we shifted from other people to us, to ourselves. And we asked the question, how do we change if we decide we want to make a change? And we looked at 2 quite different perspectives. One perspective was by the medical doctor and psychiatrist Gerald May, who's also an expert in spirituality. And what he said is, it's not really possible to change, even if you decide you want to, because we all get so stuck in our behavior patterns and our objects of addictions that once we're stuck, we can't break free under our own power. And obviously this view is similar to that held by AA and other self-help groups like that. And it fits Protestant Christianity, which we're familiar with. Then last week we looked at an opposing view, this time by secular scientists. For example, the psychologist Roy Baumeister, where he said, of course you can change. And it can be difficult, but it's certainly not impossible. And there are ways that you can make it much easier to make those changes. And so he talks about how scientists and neurologists have discovered the portion of the brain that is responsible for self-control and willpower. In other words, for change. And that that portion of the brain, like all portions, runs off of glucose. Glucose is what provides our neurotransmitters for the communication of synapses in our brain. And apparently it eats up a lot of fuel. So what he says is that the trick is learning how to manage your glucose levels through diet, sleep, and exercise, and manage your schedule, your daily life, your interactions with temptations in such a way that the most difficult things you're trying to change come during the portion of the day when your energy level is highest. So there are things you can do to make yourself successful at making these changes. So that's where we ended off. Today, we're going to go further on this idea of there's things you can do, things we all can do to make ourselves successful at making these changes toward wholeness. But before we do that, I want to stop and see if any of you have any questions or comments based on the 4 weeks we've done so far. And I'm not sure if you're able to unmute yourself. If you have any comments or questions, try unmuting yourself, see if you can talk. It's possible that that Adam has to unmute you, but let's see. Does anyone have any comments or questions? And
Greg, I have one.
Great, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is Bill Walker, in case you didn't know. Stimulants. You talk about glucose. You know, there are natural stimulants, coffee, you know, and other things like that. How is there any relationship to them with the glucose theory that they don't provide energy directly as glucose would, but they certainly have a role in how people function. My wife says, "Don't talk to me until my second cup of coffee."
No, that's a fabulous question. And I do not remember it coming up in the Baumeister book, so I can't actually answer the question, but it's a great question. You know, basically, if maintaining a constant level of glucose helps that portion of your brain use willpower, then an alternate question would be, well, does caffeine, for example, help you to do the same thing? Or no, they're unrelated and caffeine doesn't do it. And I don't know the answer to that question. You know, a similar question might be, for example, with amphetamines, you know, just that basic chemical that we call uppers, you know, maybe amphetamines might do the same thing. But I don't know the answer to those questions.
Greg, this is Bill Bradfield.
Yep.
My question has to do with Baumeister's talking about getting exercise. Exercise is kind of one of those umbrella words, covers a whole bunch of different kinds of activities, some very subtle, some very aggressive. In his book, did he really get into what kind of exercise he was talking about?
He did not, but there are plenty of other books that talk about the connection between exercise and, you know, our main topic, which is wholeness.
Yeah.
And, you know, in general, what I have seen is that exercise is one of the key components in maintaining a constant processing of nutrients and you know, using them in your body in the way that's appropriate. And so it's extremely important for maintaining that constant level. But normally what they say is that the best approach is a combination of different types of exercises. The three main ones being the aerobic, the basically stretching, you know, being limber, and then what's the third one? Stretching, aerobics, and I believe weightlifting, or, you know, resistance. So normally you're told to do some portion of each of those.
I swim twice a week for 45 minutes. And I'll tell you, when I'm through, the pain is gone. Once I heard the term endorphins, and I don't know what that is, but I think it generates something that's kind of a painkiller in your system. And I always feel really good after I've been swimming.
Yes, endorphins are natural painkillers, and they're pleasure chemicals. We like them.
We have different enzymes that are released, like serotonin, which is a feel good or feel nice, and norepinephrine, which is more stimulating. And the different activities, depending on what you're eating, everything will, there's about 4 major ones that influence how we feel. And a good balanced life helps you have all those balanced. If you have too much serotonin, you might be drinking too much too. So, you can overdo one or the other and then get addicted to that kind of stimulant, like cocaine will do with norepinephrine. They can be abused. A healthy person has a balance.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, Lori, because it connects to what we did 2 weeks ago with the Gerald May. You remember that May's thesis is you can get addicted to anything and everything, right? So we can talk about, say, artificial stimulants or uppers, right? Like illicit drugs, for example, or something that is not illicit but is nevertheless a chemical, like caffeine or sugar, which is a chemical. But you can also get addicted to your own body's endorphins. In other words, I mean, you may have heard of this, but Bill brought up exercise and how healthy that is, which is true. But people can get addicted to exercising. I'm sure you've heard of these people. And in other words, their exercise habits cross a threshold from health to unhealth, where they're doing it so much that they're actually harming their body. It's too much. It's too much wear and tear. Plus, psychologically, they're obsessed with it, so that they can't pay attention to other things and people. Yes, you're correct. But the other thing I'm glad you brought up, Lori, is that that one of the basic principles that all kinds of books talk about when it comes to health and wholeness is that the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a fancy word for talking about positive chemicals and emotions in us, is a huge benefit to health. It's also called the relaxation mode or the healing mode. At night, it's the cell repairing mode. The more often you can get that running through your system, the closer you'll get to wholeness. In contrast, if you are constantly having what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fancy word for fight and flight, if you have those chemicals running through you frequently, it leads you away from wholeness towards a lack of health.
No balance. Yeah.
Yep. Other questions and comments? Okay, so put yourself back on mute. If you're unmuted, put yourself back on mute. And what we're going to do now is I'm going to move into some new ideas. And it's a continuation of last week with the Baumeister. And first I'm going to start with a book by Rick Hanson. The name of it is Hardwiring Happiness. And let me just throw that into the chat for you all right now. And Hanson is he's a psychologist, and he has a private practice, believe it or not, right next door to me in San Rafael. And this guy is going off his work of working with clients, but also of his own life. But he not only knows psychology, he knows neurology. So this is a book that combines those two. And so what he starts out with is he talks about what we bring to any particular situation or event. And obviously events always present us with forks in the road and with choices. And what he says is that three things are present in any kind of event like that. Number one, the challenges you face. Okay, so that's simply about the external situation or circumstance. What's going on, right? So let's say you get a phone call from a family member. And let's say you don't hear from this family member very often, but they call you up and they're agitated. Maybe they're even angry. And so they're presenting you with a conflict. Okay, that's what he would call a challenge. Okay, it's about something that happens outside of you. Then the second piece that comes in is what he calls the vulnerabilities that these challenges bring to you in particular. So in other words, in what ways are you vulnerable to being pulled into this situation, this challenge? Okay. In other words, this is another way of saying, what weaknesses do you have? Okay. So for me, I come from a family, my original family of origin, 4 kids and 2 parents. All 6 of us were conflict avoiders, right? We would run from a conflict like it was death coming towards us. So I carry that into my adult life. I'm a conflict avoider. You could see that as, say, a vulnerability or a weakness about my particular way of being. So the challenge outside you, the situation, your own weaknesses, and then the third thing you bring are the opposite, your strengths as a person, as a unique individual, right? What strengths do I have for meeting that challenge in a way that is healthy, productive? Okay, and so the strengths could be my capacity for calming myself down, for accessing that relaxation mode, my social capital that I may have built. In other words, my friends, my family, my networks of relationships, my storehouse of positive experiences I've had today or this week or throughout my life. Those are the positive things I bring to this challenge. Okay, so let me give you more extensively what he talks about. He calls these inner strengths or resiliency, right? So he mentions positive embodied qualities like a positive outlook on life, or a vivacious vitality, or my own integrity, or my inner peace, or my empathy, right? My self-esteem. He also talks about perspectives I might have. So I might be somebody with common sense, or with grit, or with faith. And then he talks about skill sets. So I might be somebody with, the ability for self-regulation, or the ability, as we talked last week, to access my willpower. I may have good planning and anticipation skills, right? Those are the kinds of things he talks about when he says inner strengths. All right, so an external challenge, internal weaknesses, internal strengths. All right, now, when he talks about the strengths, he says that in any human being, about 1/3 of them are innate. In other words, you were born with them. You got them from your parents or from your DNA, right? For example, your mood. Psychologists have discovered that a portion of our mood or outlook on life is simply innate. You're born with it. Some are born with a positive, optimistic attitude. Some are born more cautious or more skeptical or even more negative. And so that to some extent, we're simply given it at birth. However, 2/3 of those inner strengths are learned behaviors. which is good news because it means if they're learned, we can change them, right? So you can see where he's going with this. If 2/3 of it are learned and we can change it, he's going to talk about some ways we can change ourselves to increase our inner strengths. All right, now, then what he does is he goes on and talks about, well, is that even possible? Can we really change ourselves to gain inner strengths? Remember, this is the same question we asked 2 weeks ago with Gerald May, where he said, no, we can't. And the same question from a week ago, where Roy Baumeister said, yes, we can. Well, Rick Hansen is going to say, yes, we can. Let's take a look at his reasons. He talks about something called neuroplasticity. And let me put this in the chat room so you can see what this word looks like. I don't know if you've ever heard that term. Doctors and neurologists and psychologists have heard it. I don't know if it's filtered down into everyday language with the public. But what it's contrasted with is the view that everybody had prior to about the last 30 years or so. But everyone means philosophers, psychologists, medical doctors, neurologists, right? That view was basically I don't know what you'd call it, neurostasis, neurodeterminism. But the idea was basically when your brain is finished developing in the teenage years, you're done. Your brain is what it's going to be from your teenage years till the day you die, right? That our brains do not actually continue changing, developing, or adjusting, right? So that combination of genes and DNA you're born with and you developed through your childhood and teen years, that sets your brain. What neurologists have discovered is that's not true. In fact, the brain is plastic, or in other words, malleable. It can be altered, changed, shifted. So, neuroplasticity. And so what he talks about initially, Rick Hansen, is what he calls experience-dependent neuroplasticity. In other words, the experiences that we have and respond to affect our brain and change it. Okay, so here's how it works. So basically, he's saying, like Baumeister, he's saying the brain's like a muscle, right? If you work a part of the brain a lot, new neural tissue grows there and new synapses grow there. So it's a bit like, the phrase is busy regions get bigger. They get more blood, they grow tissue, and they start firing more and more and more neurons. The opposite is true as well. If a part of your brain is not used very frequently, it has less neurons, less synapses, less tissue. More activity, bigger it gets, and it develops new highways. Okay, so let me show you how this works. If you routinely practice relaxation, in other words, that relaxing mode that the brain is capable of, it increases blood flow and tissue in the parts of your brain that are responsible for that, which makes it easier to become relaxed. It's an upward spiral. The more you use it, the more it's able to do it, the easier it gets, the more you're going to do it, and up and up and up and up you go, right? Okay. So what that means is your experiences which change the shape of your brain, have long-lasting impact on who you are and how you respond to situations. Okay. For example, if you keep responding in the reactive mode, fight or flight, you're actually feeding your brain with the experiences which feed the reactive mode, which make it full of new neural tissue, which means that it's easier to be reactive, which means more often and more often you keep being reactive. That's a downward spiral, right? You are actually reinforcing that reactive, impulsive, emotional mode to things. Okay. So for example, negative emotions like fear, anxiety, depression, anger, guilt, you can actually be reinforcing them and making them more frequent. All right. In contrast, as I said, having the responsive, relaxing mode can become an upward spiral. Okay. Now, here's where things get interesting. He talks about experience-dependent changes to your brain, but he also talks about self-directed changes to your brain. What he means by that is you can think ahead and plan to have experiences that feed the positive portions of your brain. Right? You can direct how your brain starts shaping and developing, right? So in other words, he says, you can use your mind to change your brain, which changes your mind into something better. In other words, more capable of wholeness. Wow. That's very promising if you want to change toward wholeness. All right, now I'm going to go on in just a minute, but let me stop here with what we've done so far with Rick Hansen and see if there are any questions or comments about what I've said so far.
Greg, we had a Indian scholar. Roberta and I were counselors for an Indian that was studying in Cal, and he shared an idea that since then I've noticed that it's pretty true. And he said, children are sponges up until the age of 10. And after that, they become analytical. And I've noticed that since then. So anyway, it's funny how the mind changes its function as you age. The other thing I'd like to share is that I'm a activities chair for a group called SIRS, and we have 35 activities for retired men, and we have a great time, and it's hardly noticing that they're aging, because there's so many choices, and they're active, and they go fishing, and there's just a whole list of activities to keep them busy and social and all of that. So anyway, I think keeping alive is very important.
Alan, thanks so much for that. And you're exactly right with your two stories, both about children and about your group. That basically what Rick Hansen is saying is that what we're used to thinking is who you are affects what you do, right? So being affects doing, but the reverse is also true. What you do affects who you are, right? Which is very hopeful when it comes to our question of how do we change towards greater and greater wholeness? Well, it turns out what you do can affect how whole you are. That's hopeful.
Okay, I want to
Other
ask.
questions or comments?
Yeah, I have a question. So let me go back to hardwiring happiness. And so then you were mentioning that challenges and vulnerabilities. And so I was thinking about, challenges can be positive or negative depending on how you handle them. And one of the things that's kind of in between what you're talking about is when you have to step in, if you can, if you are able to do that with a strong enough personality, is to set boundaries, particularly when you're dealing with narcissistic people who may be in your family or other aggressive type people. That then has its outcomes. It can be a strength, or you could be a person who sets boundaries for everybody, whether they like it or not. I mean, sometimes you have to do that as a parent, and it isn't popular. But it has its pluses and minuses, setting boundaries. And I don't know how that, I think it's set, so I'm thinking, of course, you're following, and how does this affect your brain? Because it goes one way or the other. And I'm thinking it can be strengthening for you to have self-confidence that you will not put up with X. It could be negative if you were overriding other people and not respecting valuable qualities in them. In other words, so you can stand on top of people.
Right. No, I'm glad you brought that up, Lori, because what we're looking at now, plus last week with the Baumeister, is the idea that there are things we can do to move us closer to wholeness, right? And now we're looking at our own choices and behaviors, but it absolutely connects with that question of how do we set boundaries with others, which moves us back into the relational piece, which we looked at with the Harriet Lerner and with the Marshall Rosenberg. And, they're both very honest, especially Harriet Lerner, where she says relationships are very difficult. They can be difficult, and they can be weak links for our own wholeness, right? Because we get sucked back into old behavior patterns and relational cycles. So the ability to, as Harriet Lerner says, hold our ground, but to not be in our, fight or flight aggressive mode, that takes a lot of maturity and a lot of ability. But the good news here from Rick Hansen is, hey, there are ways that we can teach ourselves to do it. Mm-hmm. We can get there.
I'm sorry, I missed that class, so that would have been helpful. Yeah, I mean, it would have talked about that.
Hey, Greg, if I could offer a comment or two on neuroplasticity. I think everybody knows I had a severe stroke about 9 years ago, and I've heard a lot about neuroplasticity from neurologists and therapists. One way I think of it is that our brains actually have surplus capacity. And if you have a brain injury, the part of the cells that are killed off, they are gone kaput. They're never going to heal. Yeah, well, you can motivate the other cells to take over some of the functionality of the dead cells over time by training. Yeah. And that's been proven with brain scans of people trying to do functions that they otherwise couldn't do. The other thing that was really interesting is one of the last interviews I had with a doctor that specialized in recovery was develop a meditation practice. It's like about the last thing I expected from a neurologist.
Let me pause everybody for a second and let you know I'm back now. So let's raise our hands so we're not talking over each other, and I will call on you methodically here so that we can give Greg a chance to hear each person. Go ahead, Tally, and then Kristen.
I'm thinking of the time that I went to the hearing doctor with a friend of mine, and he said, well, let me check your hearing, which I did. And he said, you should start wearing hearing aids. And I said, why? I can hear just fine. And he said, but without hearing aids, your brain will lose a portion of its ability to understand what you're hearing. And if with hearing aids, you'll keep that portion of your brain alive because you'll keep it working. That's why I wear hearing aids.
Walter and Tally, I'm glad you both brought these up because they are actually perfect examples of neuroplasticity. Walter, you're exactly right that stroke victims are one of the original ways that neurologists found out about the brain's neuroplasticity. basically it means that we used to think, well, when those portions of the brain that have a certain function die off for some reason, the skill is gone. But what they learned is actually people can still do the function, or they can relearn the function. What happens is different parts of the brain take over. That's neuroplasticity, the brain learning new things and finding new pathways. Tally, and you're correct. It makes Rick Hanson's point that basically you need to continue having experiences for your brain to keep having those neural pathways. If you stop having experiences like hearing certain sound tones, your brain will shut down those portions. So yes.
And Kristen, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. Just before you asked for questions, there were two things that you mentioned, the reactive response, and what was the other one? Remember?
Responsive, reactive versus responsive.
Responsive, okay. And I just want to put in a quick plug for Rick. He worked at our school as a school psychologist for a period of time, and he was just terrific with everyone. And some of us availed ourselves of his expertise, which was really great. And he also had a weekly, was it weekly or monthly, maybe, meditation at Dominican before the pandemic struck. So that might be something for all of us to look to after the pandemic, if we're interested, or if he's still going to do that, I don't know. Oh, and I want to plug Buddha Brain too. Have you read that? Buddha Brain? It's also
that was his prior book, for
Right.
which I think that was a huge bestseller.
It was,
I haven't
yeah.
read it.
Yeah, it's good. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask about, just briefly, if you could elaborate on this, is being in a state of relaxation. I would assume that would be things like meditation and things of that sort, right?
Yes, obviously relaxation is it's just one way to describe it, but what's being described is when he says responsive versus reactive. Reactive is always that fight or flight mode, and it's very quick and instantaneous, and it's self-protective. Responsive means that you're able to take a step back, we might say, or transcend the situation, we might say, but you're able to look at things with a calmer attitude and vision, and to see more of what's going on, and then to decide which would be the best path for me in this situation, and then to say, okay, I'm going to do that. And that allows you to respond the way you'd like to respond, and maybe the way that's healthiest for everyone. But it would include being more relaxed, but it includes all those chemicals from what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which means healing chemicals, happy chemicals, calming chemicals. You're working off those chemicals instead of basically adrenaline and cortisol, which are basically fight or flight. Yep.
I'll go back to his book, but the fight or flight, the adrenaline is such a rush and so instantaneous that it's important, I guess, to find a way to block that so that you don't get pulled in. I have just one more quick question. I don't mean to take up too much time. We were talking about the innate characteristics that we're born with, moods, et cetera, and we come with those. And then you broke it down. I'm trying to understand this, but 2/3 of these things that we're born with, you said that some of these things are learned. So I was just kind of confused about the innate and the learned.
Yep. Here's the figure that he gave. In terms of our inner strengths, right? The things we bring to a situation that help us cope. 1/3 of those strengths we're born with, right? From the day we're born, we have them.
Okay.
2/3 we learn along the way.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
other questions or comments?
Jane and Bill Bradfield, I see your digital hand up, and then Ken Kelser can go next.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment, and that is, I am a list maker from way back. And when I'm trying to improve myself, which is an ongoing struggle, I approach it for a list, which is counterproductive, I think I'm hearing, because I don't consider relaxing an item worthy of being on the list. What can I do to improve implies activity, not relaxation. And I know that's not right, but boy, that is so hard to fight. The tendency to see improvement as intimately connected to activity, proactivity, as opposed to how you're thinking.
Yes, and I do understand what you're saying, and certainly modern Americans, modern life, we love lists because lists are connected to basically what we call left brain thinking. Left brain thinking is math and analytical and get things done. So that, and we as Americans love that, right? Because we love technology and we love accomplishing things, right? I mean, we put people on the moon. So that part of our brain, we really do like it. And the lists fit there, okay? So you can think, well, that seems to be opposed to what Hansen is calling the response mode or relaxation. And there's some truth to that. Let's face it, lists often go with type A personalities, and type A personalities often have trouble just relaxing or being, right? So there's some truth to it. On the other hand, all of these resources, these experts that I've read, they basically say, if you want to go on the path towards wholeness, you're going to have to access the things you can do to become more healthy. Frequently, it has to do with habits. And to develop habits, you're going to have to set it as a goal and break it down into sub goals. And that requires lists, right? So yes, there's some truth about lists can help you on the path towards wholeness. Another author and book, which I use for another class, but I don't use necessarily for this class, but let me write it down for you in the chat. Okay. It is a book by an author, Atul Gawande, who wrote a best-selling book, a different best-selling book called Being Mortal. You may remember that book from, I think it's 2014 or so. Being Mortal, a big book on basically how we age, how we die. But he's a medical doctor and a surgeon. But he also wrote the book, The Checklist, because what he learned as a surgeon and being in a hospital is that almost all the mistakes that are made that sometimes lead to deaths in hospital patients are because people are not using checklists. They found that the simple tool that helps them keep people alive in a hospital is having doctors and nurses go through checklists. So he definitely would say, you want to get towards wholeness, use a checklist.
All right, and Ken.
Yes, recently I came across a statement that really impressed me. It said, playing a musical instrument will do more benefit for the brain than any other human activity. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that idea, or if you've read anything of research that's been done on people who have started playing an instrument late in life and reaped the benefits or did not reap the benefits. So do you have any thoughts about that theory?
Yes, I have two thoughts. One thought is that it's quite conceivable. You know how Kristen asked what fits under that relaxation mode? And she mentioned meditation. Well, there are numerous things that fit under it. We can add, for example, prayer. We can add doing any kind of art. We can add play. But clearly, for many people, music would fit under it. So either listening to music or performing it yourself, absolutely, probably fits under that. Now, it is possible to shove music under the fight or flight mode. And that is if somehow you are obsessive about it and don't like imperfection, right? You can beat yourself up if you're not getting it perfectly, or if it's your profession and you make money off it, right? But for most of us, when it's just a hobby, no, absolutely music would fit under the relaxation mode. The other thing about it, though, is that music taps a certain part of our brain. And I am not knowledgeable enough to know if it's left brain or right brain or both, if it somehow knits together the two hemispheres. Adam, or particularly his wife, may know more than I do about it, but absolutely, if they did an MRI while you were either listening to music or doing music, certain portions of your brain would light up, which means that music is feeding parts of your brain, and I'm almost certain they're healthy parts of your brain, right? Wholeness probably includes music.
It looks like Jane and Bill, you guys have got your hand up again, or you have a question?
I had a question, please.
Yeah, Jane.
Referring to you, is the you across the board male and female? And the difference between, I think that women are, and I'm saying this, can do multitasks, whereas men are more focused on one task at a time. Like many times I can't say, would you this might be done, but not this and this, because either he's been distracted, sorry dear, or, oh, I forgot that, because he's going like this in his direction, where I think I can speak for a lot of women, I can do this, and then I can do that, and then I can do that.
No, it's, yes, Jane, it's a great question. And what it gets into, and it's very much related to our topic today, it gets into the question of whether brains are different from one another, right? In other words, are we all born with basically the same brain, and experience is all that differentiates it? Or do brains differ, for example, by gender? Are they different? And from what I have read, there are differences in the brain that are gender specific. They develop differently in the womb because the different chemicals that surround the fetus influence how that brain develops. So there are differences. I am not skilled enough to know what those differences are. But I'm sure that neurologists, particularly those who deal with gender and neurology, do know what those differences are. That reminds me, there are 2 best-selling books out in the last decade that actually are exactly on this topic. Let me put them in the chat room. I can't remember the author, and I can't remember I think it's the same author. But the first one, I think the titles are simply The Female Brain, and then The Male Brain came after that. That was the next book. But the author is writing actually on this very topic you bring up, Jane. What is the female brain like, and what are its skills, its predilections, versus what's the male brain like? And so there is an answer to the question. And yes, they're different, and it explains why.
All right. Any other questions that I'm missing? Oh, it looks like Kristen's got her hand up again. Go ahead, Kristen. Oh, you're muted. Go ahead and unmute yourself first. There you go.
It's not a question, but music is really important to me. And one of the books that I read that was just excellent was Oliver Sacks' book called Musicology. And that has a lot in it for everybody who has an interest in music. And also health. So just wanted to throw that out.
Thanks, Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we're going to move forward now. What I'm going to do now is move into the heart of Rick Hanson's book, the part where it really gets to our question, how do we change toward wholeness? What I'm looking at first is chapter 2, which he titles Velcro for the Bad. Right? And Velcro, we're familiar with that from our clothing, what Velcro is and does. But what he says is that the human brain, through its evolutionary development, is basically made with a Velcro for bad experiences. In other words, bad experiences stick in our brains. Now, what he's going to say is that the alternative is also true. Good experiences do not. So our brains are made to latch on to negative experiences and store them in our brains, but not do the same with good experiences, right? You should see what that implies. What that implies is that we remember the bad, but not the good very much, which is a setup for unhappiness, right? We are actually geared towards being unhappy but alive, is basically what evolution does for us. Now, let me go into more detail. So what he says is that researchers have studied human beings. And if a human being, if you bring up, let's say you're a teacher or a coach or, a doctor, or even a family member or friend, if you bring up to another person 20 things they've done right and well, and one thing that they've done poorly and need to improve on, that person is not going to remember the 20 accomplishments. They're going to remember the one flaw. And we're all like that. Our brains are geared to remember the bad and forget the good. We will dwell on it, right? Similarly, for example, human beings are geared towards orienting towards both pain and pleasure. With pain, we want to remember what endangers us and what can lead to starvation. With pleasure, we remember things that may bring us shelter, food, and reproduction. And that's basically what we carry from evolution. And another psychologist, this one's famous, his name is John Gottman. Let me put his name in the chat. I'm sure many of you have heard his name. He's from the University of Washington, and he's famous for his work on relationships and divorce. What makes for a happy marriage and what leads to divorce. But his theory is that for a couple to survive and thrive, they need a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative experiences. In other words, for every negative encounter that a couple has, they need 5 good encounters to make it work. Which means that if you're having less than 5 good encounters, it's not going to work. That's similar to this experience that Hanson brings up. It's because we remember the negative experiences, but forget the positive ones, right? Now, how's this work in terms of neurology? What happens is that for any experience, good, neutral, or bad, to be stored and lodged in our brain, in the parts that we can access quickly, you have to spend 5 to 20 seconds with that experience. 5 to 20, okay? His average, he says, he's going to say is 12 seconds. You need about 12 seconds, which is roughly in between 5 and 20, right? Okay, what he says is that our brains naturally spend 5 to 20 seconds on negative experiences, which means almost all those negative experiences are getting stored in our brain in a part that's going to retrieve them quickly and easily and remember them. Okay. In contrast, this will seem counterintuitive to you, but they've done the research. Positive experiences, we frequently do not spend 5 to 20 seconds on the positive experiences. We spend less than 5 seconds. We spend a moment or 3 seconds, 4 seconds, right? We don't spend very much time on them, which means that they still get put in our brain, but they get put way in the back or in the basement. They're not put on the first floor in the front of the library, right? They're in the archives, which means they're not accessible, okay? So that's a problem. All right, now, what this means is that our brains are set up to create personalities that are looking for and focused on the negative. But that can become a downward spiral. In other words, you're feeding the part of your brain that's used to negative experiences, which means negativity becomes your daily mode of living, which means what do you look for and find? More negative experiences. This is what psychologists call confirmation bias, right? In other words, if you're looking for the negative, what are you going to find? The negative. The more you have negative, what's going to be fed? Negative, and you get that little downward spiral, okay? You know, we've all known people that are like that, either ourselves or family members or friends, right? People who nothing makes them happy is the phrase we use colloquially, right? Doesn't matter how well things go, they're going to be Eeyore, right? Oh, well, yeah, that was good, but focus on the negative. Okay. Now, here's what Rick Hanson tells us in this book, though. The same processes that can focus on and store the negative are capable of doing the same thing with the positive. There's no reason why you can't take positive experiences and store them in the front of the library as soon as you walk in the door so that you can access them. It's all the same neurology and chemical process. What's the trick? Turns out his book is pretty simple too. The trick is 12 seconds, right? So just like Baumeister said, the trick is glucose. If you want willpower, for Hanson, it's 12 seconds. In other words, you want to take positive experiences and make sure you spend at least 12 seconds enjoying them. What that does is it means that your brain will not store it in the back archives, but rather on the front of the first floor as soon as you walk in to the library. Quick and easy access to those positive experiences. Now, he has a method for doing that. Here's where his expertise in meditation and in spirituality is a help to him, but also psychology. His method, let me give you the acronym. His method is, he calls it HEAL, H-E-A-L. All right. So let me go through each of those letters in the word. First of all, you need to have a positive experience. Okay. So either you take notice of one that comes to you, or if you have to, create one yourself, or a third option is remember a past positive experience. But what you want to do is you want to enter into a positive human experience, okay, and have it. Second, the E is to enrich it. So you don't just have the experience, you amplify it. Now, how do you amplify it? First of all, in duration. This is that 12-second idea. So in other words, if normally you just enjoy it for a second or two, now you want to lengthen it so that it goes 5 to 20 seconds. So it's longer then just a moment, it's like up to 12 seconds, right? You may be familiar with this in what's called the slow food movement that came out of Italy. They basically said modern Westerners gobble down their food, and they normally do it while they're doing something else. They multitask while they're eating. Well, that guarantees that you're not actually tasting your food. You're not actually enjoying your food, right? It's going to have no positive influence on you. In contrast, the slow food movement says, you know what? When you take a bite of something, put your fork or your spoon down and chew it and taste it. And if you do it for 12 seconds, that positivity is going to be stored in the front of your brain, right? So duration, also intensity. Up the intensity of the moment. You want to pull in all your senses. And also, if it's a novel experience, that almost always goes to the front of your brain, right? So you focus on and you amplify those experiences. All right, the third letter is A, absorb. What that means is you want to let it sink in, right? We use that phrase when we talk about an experience, right? It can be either bad or good. If a bad experience sinks in, it means, wow, it really crushed us, or we got blindsided or something. But you can do it with a positive experience. You let it sink in, you absorb it, you marinate in it, right? Okay, but these are things you actually have to work at doing, because Hansen says our normal brain from evolution will only do it for the negative experiences, but not the positive. So you have to train yourself to do it for the positive. Then the last one, the L, that's really interesting and kind of surprising. But this is called let go. But what you want to start to doing when you've really learned how to do this is you start allowing negative experiences to become a part of positive experiences. Because what he says is that real life it doesn't often present unbiased, pure, good experiences. Rather, we have the phrase, well, you take the good with the bad. That's because life is nuanced. It's complicated. You're going to get both. And so what you want to train yourself is to not freak out when the bad comes, but to allow it to be itself while also taking in the good. Classic example of this is, guess what's coming in a few weeks? Thanksgiving. Guess what happens? We gather with our families, with friends. Guess what also always happens? Unless you're the rare person who has the completely functional family, there's going to be some dysfunction with your family over Thanksgiving, right? So that last part of L means that you learn how to bring in those not so good experiences, and they're part of the good experiences, but you're able to let go, let be the negative, but soak in the positive. Guess what that's going to do? It's not only going to get you through Thanksgiving, it's going to make Thanksgiving an overwhelmingly positive experiences, even though there are negative parts of it. So that's his prescription for how to take your brain and your personality that may be more geared towards negativity and unhappiness, and actually shift it to positivity and happiness, right? Which is going to make you more whole, more healthy, more happy, right? And we can control it if we learn this simple process of taking in good experiences and letting them sink in for 12 seconds. And you can do this multiple times a day with even little itty bitty positives. So that's his theory. Questions or comments about this?
All right, I saw Towley's hand first, and then Brad, and then Alan.
I just want to say that we train everybody in our country to look for the negatives. You go You're evaluated on your job. They never come up with what you're doing well. It's always, what can you do better? What needs to be corrected? A teacher, I stopped grading wrong answers with red and started grading good answers with green. Yes, it took me longer because there were more good answers than there were bad answers, but my students never got a red F on a paper.
No, Tally, yeah, you're exactly right. And it's teaching is connected, just like coaching or anything else. It's connected to this theory, right? But in other words, you could give, you could give many positive comments about a paper, but the students are going to focus on that red ink. They're going to focus on what you criticized. But the good news is that what Hansen is teaching us is how to change ourselves and our actual brains so that we're able to take in the good and move through it in that happier, relaxed mode.
I never called home with a negative content. I got in touch with the parents in person, but not on the phone. And I only called home with good messages. And it made a tremendous difference in my relationship to students.
All right. And Brad, I think you were next.
Yeah, I was just going to share that part of Pacific Institute that Pacific Telephone brought in to help managers be more positive and affect change. And we did visualization. And it follows some of the same thoughts of spending time visualizing positive behaviors, maybe behaviors that you don't have right now, but you aspire to have. And over time, let's say every night going to bed and just saying how good you feel looking, 20 pounds less. I mean, visualizing yourself losing that weight, or visualizing yourself in presentation mode to a number of managers that maybe you're uncomfortable doing. But if you visualize the good feeling of being successful, over time that changes your image inside of you and becomes part of your regular behavior. And it works. It really does work.
Yes, this, what we're talking about, and Brad, what you just talked about, which that a company did with the employees. Traditionally, in both the East and the West, this conversation would come under the category of the soul, or the human spirit, or maybe the psyche, right? But what is helpful about, for example, the Baumeister last week, and even the Gerald May 2 weeks ago, but then this week with Hansen, is that he says he doesn't exclude those categories, but he adds to them biochemical and neurological. He basically says that if you do these things, you're not just lifting up your mood or your soul, you're actually putting chemicals in your body, and you're building synapses in your brain, which make you happier, healthier, stronger. So there's science that goes behind this.
And Alan, I think you were next.
Yeah, a couple things. Back in the early 60s, one of my early clients said, she said, you remember being punished for the wrong thing, but if you did something wrong and you're punished, you don't remember that. It's only if you were punished unfairly. And the other thing too to think about, that I've been thinking about after all of your wisdom and everything, is that, the Lord's Prayer covers a lot of what you're covering.
No, absolutely. Rick Hansen, he does connect a lot of this theory to Buddhism, which is his practicing faith. But I guarantee virtually everything he says also connects to Christianity and our faith. And it's not hard at all to find it in the Old and New Testament.
All right. And I saw Bill Walker first, and then Jane and Bill Bradfield.
Okay. I just thought I would share a real life experience from related to your 5-to-1 ratio on good to bad. All right. Spent a number of years living in Virginia, working in an office building in Washington, D.C. And in order to get there, we had to take a carpool. And there were many routes you could take, all of them bad. Yeah. So the standing rule in the carpool was driver's choice, and everybody else do not criticize the driver and say anything bad about the experience of the day. Okay. And so, as a matter of fact, then at the end of the day, if you could remember some pleasant experience, then relate it to the driver. Okay. Now, then the standard rule, related to your 5-to-1 was that after a while, we intend to accumulate in the carpool, 5 people, an atmosphere of that was relatively pleasant, based upon all of the attaboys, right, that we would accumulate. But the standing rule was, remember, it only takes one aw shit to wipe them all out.
Oh, God.
No, that's exactly the principle. Very well said, Bill.
I want to say, Brad, I so agree with you in regards to visualization. I detest freeway driving. So before I go on the on-ramp, I say, dear Lord, please give me a window. And I visualize there's going to be a window for me to get on that freeway. And it always has. I am a true believer in visualization. Thank you.
What this Hansen book gets at is there are a couple of things that we have control over, right? We have free will, we have willpower that can actually help us quite a bit in terms of being a more whole person and a happier person and more like somebody who's capable of doing these I-thou relationships. One of them is we can plan in our day, in our week, activities that are pluses, that are positive, right? Because what Hansen is saying is when you have those positive experiences and you savor them, right? You take them in, what happens is it changes your brain for the healthier, for the better, right? So this is, it's a little bit like the colloquial phrase we say, which is, don't be all work and no play. Hansen is showing us why that's true. If you build into each day, each week, pleasurable things, things you enjoy, things that make you happy, you're going to be a healthier person because you got a healthier brain. The other thing that this mentions, again, which you have control over, is what we would call your self-talk. How are you talking to yourself? What kinds of things are you internally saying to yourself throughout the day, right? In other words, you could be saying over and over again, oh, that went wrong. Oh, you blew that. Oh, something bad's coming in a little bit, right? Negative self-talk. Or you could have positive self-talk, and this does connect to the Bible. For example, there's nothing preventing any of us as Christians from saying continuously throughout a day, wow, Jesus loves me. Wow, God thinks I'm worth all the efforts God has made, right? Positive reaffirmation. Or you could say, my beloved loves me, or I have a great brother who enjoys talking to me. Or you could say, as Jesus said, wow, look at that lily in the field. It sure is gorgeous. Not even Solomon is arrayed like that lily. I think I'll take a moment to enjoy it, right? This is Shakespeare, smell the roses kind of stuff. We have control over that. And Hansen is saying it's going to make for a healthier brain, healthier chemicals in your system, which is going to increase the ability for you to have a healthy life.
Other questions for Greg? Anybody else have anything else before we close out here? It looks like Kristen, I see your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Kristen.
I just need the title, Greg, of, was it John Goodman, his book? What it was? Yeah, John Gottman, I'm sorry. What was that?
You know, he has several books, and I can't remember them, but it may be the 5 somethings of a healthy marriage. But trust me, all you need to do is go on Amazon, type in his name, John Gottman, under books, and it'll give his multiple books.
It was female brain and male brain.
And the checklist was by whom, the author?
Atul Gawande, Gawande, Gawande.
Thank you.
All right, looks like Walt and then Tally.
Okay, Greg, I hope this is a straightforward question, but I can't recall the big passage reference, but in one of the Gospels, I believe that Jesus is teaching and refers to if the eye is not healthy, then the whole being is not healthy. And I've wondered whether or not he's talking about confirmation bias. If we go into a situation looking for bad things to happen, that's exactly what we'll find.
Yes, he is. That's very perceptive, Walt. You're exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
And then we had Tally and then Jane and Bill Bradfield.
I just wanted to say that my first thought every morning when I wake up is, dear God, what pleasant thing is going to surprise me today? And then I start looking there. I've never been disappointed. There has always been a pleasant thing. Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's little, but I'm always looking for a pleasant thing, and I find it.
Yep, I do something similar where I say in the morning, okay, God, how are you going to show up today? Because I know you're going to show up. And I'm looking through the day for how God is going to show up. Or another version of it is I'm looking for your grace today because I'm sure you're going to give me grace. So let me hunt for it. That's exactly what Hansen is talking about.
And then Jane and Bill Bradfield.
Okay. Like Tally, I'm a retired teacher, so I'm going to tell a classroom story. But I taught a lot of middle school math, which should explain my first comment. But anyway, one of the attitudes in middle school, especially, you're working on attitudes and self-image and skill building, and I would try, it was unavoidable that I was going to mark answers wrong. They were wrong, but that wasn't the sin. I tried to get the kids to understand that a wrong answer was an opportunity for improvement. And then I try to teach them for skills and how do they confront that? How do they work towards improvement when they couldn't get something right, which I won't go into here. But just that attitude, how often in life do we not even allow ourselves that? We don't look at, we tend to label our mistakes as forever mistakes and of no value. But mistakes do have value. They are opportunities to improve. And I guess I'm saying that we all need a teacher who pats us on the head every once in a while and writes in green ink, good job.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. How this relates to what we've been talking about the whole series. But today with Hansen, we're looking at what can I as an individual do to help move on the path towards wholeness. And so he gives this very concrete suggestion of, you know what, figure out how to have and enrich and absorb positive experiences. that's going to change your brain and make it more capable of wholeness. But, we don't, as we've seen, we don't exist as individuals in a vacuum. And the fact is, my doing Hanson's project is going to be easier if I associate myself with other people who do something similar, right? If I associate myself with people who actually don't do it, but focus on the negative, either in themselves or in life or in me, it's going to be harder. I'm going to be going up against resistance. And that's where it connects once again to the boundary keeping and the use of the Harriet Lerner and the Marshall Rosenberg that we looked at several weeks ago. All right, one more question or comment.
And I think I saw the prawns hand up if they still had something.
I was just going to add to Bill's that the way we looked at it was there are no problems, just opportunities to be solved.
Great, yes. All right, let me tell you where we're going to go. Next week is the last class. It's very important. So I do encourage you to all come to it, because what we're going to do is we're going to step back from these 5 sessions and pull it all together. And we're going to do so consciously as Christians, as believers. What can we understand is God's way of changing us towards wholeness? Because we already know from our faith, from the scriptures, from church, that God, in fact, wants to change us towards wholeness and has promised to do so. It's going to happen. So the question is, how does it happen? Are we capable of it or not? And what's our role in making those changes? So that's going to help us understand which of these authors and resources are most helpful in doing God's way of changing us towards wholeness. So that's the plan. And so come back next week and we'll take a look at what God has to say to us.